Hi, welcome everyone. We'll get started in just a few moments. Hi, welcome everyone. My name is Sarah Carr, and I'm Chief Knowledge Broker for Octo, Open Communications for the Ocean. Um, we'd like to welcome you here today to our webinar on What If We Fished MPAs Sometimes, a synthesis of research on temporary marine protection. And we're very pleased to welcome our presenters here today, Tasha Quintana from the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, Aceves Bueno from the University of Washington, and John Wencélius from CRIOBE. To let you know, Octo is an NGO that connects ocean professionals to the knowledge and networks they need through our webinar series and our MPA help, EBM help, and ocean plastic list communities. We also provide custom consulting services. Today, we're going to hear from Tasha, Era, and Jean. And then afterwards, we will have dedicated time for question and answer. You can send in questions at any point during the webinar. You can send them in through the chat or the Q&A panel. The chat is also enabled so that you can share information with everyone on the webinar. And we encourage you to send, but include any relevant information that would be of use to other um, participants today. We just ask that anything you post in the chat be professional and on topic. Um, I also wanted to let you know a recording of today's webinar will be available later today or by tomorrow at the latest on the Octo website on the webinars page. So again, thank you all for being here today, and thank you so much, Tasha, Era, and Jean, for coming to talk to us about this research. We're very excited to learn more. And I'll turn it over to you guys now.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that great introduction. And we are so thrilled to be sharing our research from the Tempo team with the specific group, this MPA audience. So as Sarah mentioned, and just I'll repeat the introductions for anyone who's joining a little bit late. My name is Tasha Quintana, Anastasia Tasha. I'm a staff scientist at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute based in Panama City, Panama. And there I'm part of a growing team of social scientists who are studying resilience. And my research is on the governance of the commons. In Tempo, I contribute, in Tempo, I contribute ethnographic expertise from Mexico, where I've been studying temporary closures for more than 10 years, and I lead the Tempo team. With me today are two of my co-leads of Tempo. We have Aceves Bueno. She's an assistant professor at the University of Washington. Her research is focused on policy and building resilience to climate change. And in Tempo, she leads the theoretical and conceptual advances, mostly through bioeconomic modeling. Ere is from Baja California, which is the site of the first temporary closures in Mexico. And we also have Jean, who's a junior professor at CRIOBE, and he's an environmental anthropologist working on coral reef fisheries. He's based in Morea, where he spends most of his on and off time with local reef fishers, I can confirm. And in Tempo, he oversees the ethnographic work that's carried out on local perceptions of temporary closures across various stakeholders. So I want to start out today's talk by talking about one of the key challenges of 21st century marine conservation. Conservation today still has these traditional aims of protecting biodiversity and sustaining ecosystems in the face of really difficult threats. And at the same time, there's increasing pressure to simultaneously provide local livelihoods, support thriving coastal communities, and provide jobs through the blue economy. And it's really hard to do both of these things. As someone who's interested in policies, a central question for me is what policies actually support both of these in practice, not just in theory. So today we'll discuss whether that is or could be temporary closures. And the purpose of our talk is to convince you not that temporary closures do this, but that you should be thinking a little bit more about temporary closures, especially if you're in the area-based marine conservation space. So area-based marine conservation is arguably more relevant than ever as countries and industries and people fight over the use of the ocean. And this fight is in many ways increasingly a fight over space and zoning. 30 by 30 is one of the big ones. For those who don't know, it's the goal, the target to protect 30% of the ocean by 2030. And so far, over 190 countries have committed to this goal. Current protection is currently just under 10%. So you can do the math. It's a big gap to 30 by 30. And so there's this question, which is how can countries and conservation practitioners move towards this 30% target? And I know if I was to do a who here question about this, probably a ton of you have experience and expertise that speaks directly to this question. Now, the way that most people imagining achieving this 30% goal is through marine protected areas. And it's a bit of an assumption. At least we can say that of the 10% that's currently protected, most of that is through marine protected areas or MPAs. And sorry for the jargon, I will use the term MPA throughout this talk. So please bear with me. I know we have a lot of MPA professionals here. I just want to talk through some basic MPA science for anyone who might not be familiar. So there's a lot of strong evidence that marine protected areas increase the biodiversity and size of fishes within their boundaries. And there's also evidence that they contribute to nearby fisheries. This happens through the spillover of adults from inside the area to outside, but also the spillover of larvae. When fish inside get very large and produce more larvae, and they can actually seed fisheries outside. And more recently, there's increasing evidence that MPAs also influence, improve well being, causing positive well being outcomes for nearby communities more often than they cause negative well being outcomes. And interestingly, the same characteristics associated with positive well being outcomes for MPAs are the characteristics that are associated with positive biodiversity outcomes. And those are these three being no take, which means that no fishing is allowed inside of them, being well enforced, and being old. And partly because of this, and partly for other reasons, this has led to an assumption that permanency is best, or a focus on permanency and long-term protection in marine protected areas. But permanent MPAs also have a number of failures. First, paper parks. These are parks that exist only on paper, essentially, and there's not actual protection happening in the water. This can happen from lack of enforcement or lack of compliance or lack of stewardship. And this can happen because it's often hard to get fishers on board with permanently protecting areas. But there's also this second issue, which is PAD, protected area downgrading, downsizing, and degazettement. I'm not going to get into the details here, but there's numerous cases of permanent protected areas being actually taken away or downgraded, and it's more common than you think. And so this leads us to question how permanent are permanent areas? To some extent, permanence is a fallacy because you never know what's going to happen in the future. So this has led our team to think more about this. Why is permanency, we've thought a lot about permanency. Why is permanency the default? I mentioned the fact that old age is associated with positive outcomes for marine protected areas, but there's other reasons too. So populations can grow slowly while fishing can happen fast. So this can be bad for example, long-lived species like sharks or other top predators. Also, there's evidence from some periodic harvests where a reef might be closed for years and opened only for a day or 2 weeks, depending on the case. But in one paper, they found that in a single 13-day harvest, sometimes it's not the norm, but it can happen that there's more fishing pressure in that one 13-day harvest than there is in the rest of the year in nearby reefs. So these are some of the fears of opening for fishing. But a thing that we've reflected on in our group, and this is some thinking by Matt Lauer at SDSU, is that permanency is not neutral. It's a political stance, and it reflects a desire to stabilize a world that is dynamic. And permanency, the ideas of permanency in conservation, are embedded in a modernist temporal regime that sees time as linear, from the past to the present to the future, as uniform, the same everywhere, and time as a container, an empty container to be filled with action. And this eliminates uncertainty by projecting conservation onto this indefinite future, regardless of ecological or social change. And a permanent model of conservation flattens temporal diversity and displaces time-bound management that involves synchronizing human action with social ecological rhythms. But we know that temporary closures exist in the world. These are three types that Ere will talk a little bit more about in a moment. We conducted a systematic literature review. This is being led by Yutian Fang at UC Santa Barbara. And I'm not going to get into the details here, but temporary closures are spread all over the world in high income countries and low income countries. And they're quite diverse. And just as sort of to get some ecologist antennas, going here, there's some ecological reasons to pay attention to temporary closures. So we've found that on average, temporary closures tend to increase biomass and to a lesser degree abundance, at least before periodic harvest if they are periodically harvested. Um, but I want to make an important note here. Most of the time, these studies have compared temporary closures to open access areas. And in very few cases have they actually been compared to permanent MPAs. In those cases, temporary closures do tend to perform similarly to permanent MPAs before openings. But these are some reasons why ecologically it might be interesting to think a little more about temporary closures. And to summarize, and this is just sort of a background for our talk today, to summarize the risks if we ignore temporality and continue to focus on permanent MPAs. First, we know that permanent MPAs are best when they're enforced and complied with, but this can lead to really high enforcement costs and high social costs as well. Permanent MPAs can alienate fishers when fishers don't want permanent MPAs. It also can, permanent MPAs can struggle to adapt to things like large-scale species shifts that we might expect from climate change, political change, or even social changes like migration. Also, we might be ignoring the inevitable. As I mentioned with PAD, protected areas that are permanent might still be taken away in the long run, especially if they're unpopular. Now, what we're going to sort of give some evidence, at least that we've collected today, the potential good side, the opportunities of engaging with temporality. First, it allows another dimension to play with social ecological fit of policies to the reality of the water. We're curious to what extent these could be a kind of Goldilocks policy that allows fishing while also protecting for 30 by 30. Jean will talk today about how people have been brought in through iterative decision making with these temporary closures. And adaptation is really built in to temporary closures in a way that's not with a permanent MPA. Also, we know there's many of these closures out there, so why not consider these and participating in this global effort for conservation, even though they don't meet this standard of permanency? And finally, we're nerds here. We think that there's a real research opportunity, and we don't want to miss this big part of research of what we can learn from temporary closures. So the plan for today, I'll give a speedy intro to tempo to us as a team, and then Ere will talk about some conceptual advances that we've made. Then we'll go into our results, in some cases preliminary. Jean will talk about adaptation, harvests, and commenting. Ere will talk about property rights, and I will wrap up by talking about success and failure. And we're really excited for the Q&A, so please, yeah, we're really excited to hear from your experiences and thoughts on all this. So first, who are we? We are Tempo. We're an international group of students, researchers, and community partners studying temporary fisheries closures. And we're funded by an NSF Dices Award. Really, none of this work would have been possible without the National Science Foundation and this big funding, so we're really thankful for that. TEMPO stands for Temporal, Eco-Social Management and Productivity of the Oceans. I also want to note that in this talk we sometimes use the word tempo as a shorthand for temporary closures. So if we say tempo sometimes, I'm sorry, we use it for both our team name and for temporary closures. But if you're interested to learn more about our team and our research, please check out our website or feel free to send me an email after the talk. There's three big research questions that guide our work at Tempo. First, what is the context where temporary closures tend to emerge around the world? Second, what happens in the water What are the social ecological interactions and trade-offs? And third, how do different stakeholders construct success and failure of these closures? And I really want to draw attention to that third piece. We're really interested in these closures as social ecological systems, which sort of is below in this box. But we're also really interested in the ways that different types of stakeholders are constructing the success and failure. And we're not defining that a priori from the outset. And we think that this is particularly important with temporary closures because the constructions of success and failure determine how fishers act or not. Their actions will depend on whether they think it's a success or a failure. And that's true for fishers, also state officials and scientists, that their actions depend on whether they perceive these as successes or failures. And for dynamic policy tools, it's especially important. Sorry for the ugly slide, but I really want to give you a sense of how broad our project is. These are the methods that we're using to answer these questions. Our scale ranges from deep dives into individual cases of temporary closures, ethnography, and ecosystem monitoring, all the way up to these really broad global studies, a systematic literature review, and some theoretical bioeconomic modeling. Also, all of our approach is social and ecological. We might conduct certain research activities within a social or ecological bucket, but they're all speaking to each other. So, Ere, we'll talk next about conceptual advances.
Thank you, Tasha. Okay, so one of the most important things that we noticed is that because time has been in the backdrop of our conversation, almost all the discussions on design have been led by space. So all of us are very, very familiar probably with conversations about how big should MPAs be, how many MPAs should we have, where should they be placed? But this has made it so that time is just in the back of our imaginations. So what we're trying to do here with this project is to bring it to the foreground of research. And one of the, this is important because time actually creates very important trade-offs that space does not show. So it creates trade-offs both social and ecological, and also it configures how power and learning and resilience happen in these places. So one of the first problems we faced when trying to elevate the research on time is that we realized that the term temporary closures is used for many, many different systems, so it's very ambiguous. So here I'm just showing a few examples of systems that are called temporary closures, and it goes all the way from rotational closures to the rahui in French Polynesia that can have many, many different shapes. And another thing that we noticed is that most of this research has been focused on seasonal closures. The reason for it is seasonal closures are very widely used for fisheries management. These are tools, for those that are not familiar with them, these are tools that protect a species for a period of time, mostly related to some part of their life history. They usually last about 3 months. And the reason why they've been heavily studied is that they're at the center of a lot of sort of conflict to understand how much benefits they bring, because they can also cause a lot of problems to sustainability. But what we want to do is to expand the discussion beyond seasonal closures. Next. So the first step that we took was a literature review that is being led by Yutian Fang, a PhD student at UC Santa Barbara. And what she found is that there's a wider range of temporary closures around the world. Many cases are represented by periodic closures. All of these closures represent very different systems. But then what we noticed is the concepts used for these closures. So what a periodic closure is called in one place can be different, it can represent a very different system in a different place. So this really complicates the analysis. And then the other thing that we found is that most of these studies focus on specific case studies, but none of them have systematically analyzed temporary closures and compared their outcomes. So in order to do that, we needed to sort of create a more abstract way of defining them. So we created a framework that divides up closures in two main characteristics. The first one is the system duration. So what this defines is if there is a specific date where the system is expected to expire. And the other one is cyclicity. Is the system open to fishing at certain points in time? And how often does that happen and for how long? So this framework allows us to start categorizing the systems between if they expire or not, and then if they're cyclical or non-cyclical. And then the cyclical closures can further be explored through the access rates or the access ratios that are similar to, for those that are fanatics of engineering, a duty cycle. So these access ratios allow us to categorize these closures, not only through if they have access, but also how that access happens. So for example, here the duty cycle is allowing us to categorize a closure in French Polynesia, in Papara. In this closure, we see that the closure can be closed for many, many years, and then just allow access as a pulse of one day. That is very different than the closures that we see in Zanzibar, where there are closures of 9 months and openings of only 3 months. And you can imagine how different the outcomes are, both social and ecological, from these two types of closures. So in our work, we're starting to disentangle all of these closures by digging deep into two systems that are very different comparatively. So in one hand, we have the zonas de refugio in Mexico that are determinate. They have an expected date to expire, which happens after 5 years. Most of these closures are designed by fishers. And Tasha is going to go a lot deeper into how they are structured and how they work. And then we are also working a lot in French Polynesia. Here, temporary closures can take many, many different shapes. They can go from 2 to 12 years of closure. They can be rotational, and they can be open only for feasts or for a few days. So John now is going to talk a little bit more about these closures.
Thank you, Ere. Thank you, Tasha. So indeed, I'm going to take a deep dive into the rehuis in French Polynesia, which are a form, next slide please, Tasha, of customary management of resources, both land and sea. They're really widespread in Oceania, probably underdocumented. And I'll go really in a deep dive in what we call rehui in Polynesia, but that can be called tapu, tabu, bull, all over Oceania. Next slide, please. One of the characteristics of these rehuis in French Polynesia is that they are all but permanent. So they can fall in these 3 categories here that I've taken from Ere's conceptual model. Next slide. And I wanted to get back to the slide presented by Tasha earlier, showing that why is permanency the default? And now I want to take another perspective, take the perspective of fishers in French Polynesia, of why permanency is not the default for fishers. So there's several arguments that fishers, Polynesian fishers, often bring to the table to refuse permanent areas. One is the foreign concept of conservation for the sake of conservation. For many indigenous people, fish is a resource, and the idea of conserving for the sake of conservation is a bit foreign. Other components that are often brought to the table are questions of injustice, whether social among stakeholders, where permanent closures can be seen as benefiting more tourist operators or other actors and stakeholders. Another big one is spatial injustice. People that live right in front of an MPA have to accommodate much more than neighboring communities. And also some interesting things we came across in French Polynesia is the risk of bioaccumulation of some toxins along the food chain in permanent areas, and that spillover fish might become more prone to being toxic, such as ciguatera. But that's an avenue we're really excited to look further into. Next slide. And so basically here, by presenting the cases of rehui in French Polynesia, The idea is to show how time-bound closures bring at least two important dimensions socially that are thought to be really important for marine management. One is processes of co-learning among and between communities. And one is that, as Tasha mentioned earlier, is that adaptive management, which is seen as crucial for marine but also terrestrial management, is sort of weaved into temporary closures. Next slide. So what is Rahui? Let me take a bit of time to try to define this. As many Polynesian words, Rahui has several meanings. One, it's a territorial unit ranging from reef crest to mountain ridges. It's an institution through which usually nobles back in the time or village heads, chiefs, instaured a temporary ban on a resource or on a practice such as fishing or hunting. And more philosophically, it's an idea that resources have these natural cycles on which humans act through institutions. Next slide. What's really important is that the concept of Rahui in many of the Polynesian languages cannot be considered as a conservation ethic that these communities would have had for centuries, but it's a tool geared towards production, making sure that there's enough resource when they are needed for social cultural purposes such as feasts, weddings, and important social cultural events. And another important dimension is that Rahui are necessarily time-bound in the sense that they are cyclical and they're never seen as permanent. Next slide. And so the concept is very old, predates European contact in Oceania, but they have been banned through colonial administration in many countries. In French Polynesia, the first cases of renaissance of Rahui was in cases of very remote island, as the case of Rapa Island, which is really the most remote island in French Polynesia. It's fully community-based, and we'll talk more about it. But since the early 2000s, 2010s, next slide, Tasha, the Rahui has been also used in more hybrid contexts. So wielding the concept, the traditional customary concept with central legal frameworks such as fishing regulated zones or other tools designed by the central government of French Polynesia. Next slide, please. And so the sort of framework we're using to think about how temporary closures can bring along important dimensions in terms of adaptive management or in terms of co-learning is to look at how the processes of designing and thinking about the next rounds of closures and harvesting bring along various forms of stakeholder engagement and negotiations across diversity of goals people have when designing these closures. We'll get back to it later during this talk. Next slide, please. So let me take a deep dive in Tahiti, which is the most populated island of French Polynesia. So please bear with me. I'll go through different cases. Take a look at the square, the red square at the bottom of the slide as we'll move in different places in Tahiti. So the first hybrid Rahui, hybrid in the sense that it uses this traditional term and weaves it with a legal framework provided by the French Polynesian government. So this first one was created in Te Ahupo that maybe many of you know because of the super surf wave that's renowned in Te Ahupo, originally designed to be closed for 3 years. Nowadays, and that's important, 10 years later, it's still closed as the people decided to renew its closure every 3 years. Next slide. A couple of years later, a neighboring community also wanted to do something about lagoon resources in space and designed this really innovative marine management design with 3 zones, a central zone, which kind of looks like an MPA, designed to be permanent, and 2 buffer zones that were intended to be opened alternatively for relatively long periods of time. The initial design was to close for 3 years and then to take decisions on what to do after these 3 years with the buffer zones. Next slide. So here we're in Mateia and Papara, another community in Tahiti, 2 communities that joined forces to protect a single lagoon for 2 years. Next slide. When the 2 years expire, there's been a bit of a tension between the 2 communities. One on the left-hand side of the slide decides to keep the closure closed for another 2 years, while the other community decides to fully open it to harvest because fishers really asked for that. And even though there wasn't any ecological monitoring of what happened during these harvests, there was a huge media coverage on depicting this opening and this harvest as a disaster, with the bulk of the biomass that had increased for 2 years that's been harvested in a couple of weeks. And so a couple months later, Tautira, remember this rahui that had the 3 different zones, learned from the experience of Mateya and are sort of frightened. And instead of opening alternatively one of the 2 buffer zones for relatively long periods of time, decided to have this very timid opening of 2 half-days before reclosing for 4 years. Very timid opening because there were also gear restrictions, length-based restrictions for some species. Next slide. And what we learned from this opening that we've monitored really closely with our team of scientists, and mainly with Marguerite Tayarui, a PhD student that we work with here in French Polynesia, is that these openings created really interesting social arenas of dense interactions between stakeholders, a lot of meetings, balancing fishers and scientist expertise. Fishers were really happy, even though it was short, 2 half-days, to be able to go in the rahui to see how it had been effective. They talked about important fish sizes, abundance, and that was really a nice opportunity, and also an opportunity through this citizen science dialogue to think about new innovative monitoring. We'll talk maybe a bit more about it in the Q&A. Next slide. And so Papara, remember, it's that community that decided to renew its rahui after 2 years. Same thing, saw what happened in Tautira, that the opening was pretty interesting opportunity, and decided also for a timid reopening of 2 half-days before reclosing for 4 years. Same thing, we monitored this. Next slide, Tasha, please. And what we learned from this is also this really interesting moment where different stakeholders who don't usually meet have the opportunity to meet. There were renowned poachers that came at the opening that had the opportunity to discuss with the most the people that were the most enthusiastic about the rahui. There was the fisheries agency president, scientists, and these people don't really get a chance to meet, to discuss goals, to discuss what's going wrong, what's going well with the rahui. So that was really an interesting opportunity. And it also created changes in the governance structure by including more fishers into the steering committee of the rahui. Next slide. So one key point is that because of these cycles of closing, opening, there's always space to discuss, negotiate goals, and this can reconfigure power relations in the decision-making, which is really important in resource management. Next slide. And finally, Tautira, who had this first opening in 2023, intended to close for another 4 years. Well, they realized that their rahui was working well and decided to reopen because they really saw the opportunity of having these openings as a key social event. So they reopened for 2 days, and same thing, we were around, but what we learned there, the next slide, Tasha, is well, for the first opening in Tautira, scientists were really present, really helped out in thinking about the opening. For this second opening, scientists were on the backseat. They were backseat passengers. The community, the steering committee really took the steering ship, and it indicated increased stewardship. And this was because one of our arguments is that because fishers had went to the first opening, they saw how it worked. They were really eager to participate more in the management of their rahui and their different harvests. Next slide. So the second key point is that these temporary closures, by creating these spaces of social interactions, of possibility to go into the protected areas to see what's happening, increases a sense of ownership and stewardship, which is another factor that is often put as really important in marine or terrestrial resource management. Next slide. So basically, if we try to take the framework I presented earlier and look at it through time, how this works. So this is obviously simplistic, but the idea is, well, in permanent designs, usually you have a lot of interactions at the beginning when you want to design the MPA, the permanent closure, but usually it doesn't really need to go through cycles of renegotiation, even though some try to go for adaptive management, but that requires really some willingness to do it. Next slide, Tasha. In the cases of temporary closures, well, because we have set several cycles. And Tasha, if you can go back and forth with the next slide. Each cycle can allow for adaptive management. Each cycle, you have negotiations between stakeholders, thinking, why are we doing this? Who are we doing it for? And then this can really put forward this question of adaptive management in marine resource management. Next slide, Tasha, please. And so these are one of the key sort of added values of temporary closures in terms of social impact and stewardship, co-learning, adaptive management. But what happens in terms of the ecological impacts of harvest? We've touched upon it a bit, but I'd like to go a bit further down the line. Next slide, Tasha, please. So what do we know of the impacts of periodically harvested closures that have been documented mainly in the Pacific? Well, they show that periodically harvested closures often reduce fish wariness. And this was probably something that way back in time, oceanian communities sort of tried to act upon. And so this means high efficiency post-harvest between closures. In this paper, authors also look, well, does it also produce other impacts outside the closures, like MPA do, in increasing overall fish biomass, increasing fisheries yields outside the closures? And well, the message is not very straightforward, but it all depends on a lot of things. The duty cycle that Ere mentioned, the extent, the spatial extent of the closure. But this question of cycle is really important in understanding what benefits temporary closures can bring even outside the reserves. Next slide. What we know is that they work really well for some species. In cases of very short-lived species, short spawning species such as octopus in the Indian Ocean, temporary closures have shown to bring along multidimensional benefits, both in terms of increase of biomass and human well-being. And also a great argument of this last paper is that, well, periodic closures is also an important stepping stone to broader management. It's a way to engage with fishers that are usually kind of reluctant to engage in debates around MPAs, permanent MPAs. And so temporary closures can be a really good way to go for a broader thinking about management and having fishers on board. Next slide. Where there's a big knowledge gap is around multi-species fisheries, which is the case for a lot of coral reef fisheries we're interested in. When you have a lot of species, they all have different life history parameters, growth rate, age at 6-year-old maturity. And this questions brings in a lot of complexity in understanding the ecological impacts of temporary closures. Next slide, please, Tasha. So in the case of the first opening in Tautira, we really monitored this closely. And so the first graph you see here in the middle are the impacts of 4 years of full protection of the 3 zones I mentioned. And what really strikingly appears is that the Irahui had a really positive impact on short-lived species such as parrotfish down in the bottom left, such as soldierfish on the top left. But on longer-lived species such as naso or groupers, the impacts of 4 years of protection were probably not enough to see an increase in size. We also monitored before and after the harvest through visual underwater visual fish counts, and we don't see a clear signal of what happened during the harvest. There was 1 ton of fish that were harvested, but the underwater visual fish counts weren't able to detect that impact. So that questions also which methods are used to monitor these periodically harvested closures. Next slide. Key takeaways is that temporary closures bring a lot of uncertainty around management, and especially around cycles, duty cycles, access cycles, as Ere mentioned, and raises a lot of questions on what do we do during openings? When do we open? What type of gear do we allow? What type of species do we catch? And it opens up this space for science-fisher dialogue, which is really interesting and paves the way for innovative ways of tracking all of this in more scientific terms. Next slide. And so another big question, and this is something we really opened up recently, is thinking about how temporary closures can bring along social benefits through increased commoning of the resource. Next slide. And this came through presentations of CRIOBE, so an NGO in Mexico, showcasing what happened in Mexico during COVID, where some communities and co-ops decided to open their closure for harvest for a couple of days. And what happened is that fishers were able to go into these reserves to harvest invertebrates, so abalone and urchins, and they pooled their catch together for collective purposes at the co-op level or community level. So this was really interesting, sort of a system as banking, the reserve as a bank for the community. Next slide. The same thing happens in Rapa that I mentioned earlier, which is a really community-based Rahui event. When they open the Rahuis, they pull the resource together, share it, in some cases, share it among community members, even those that didn't partake in the fishing. So this also helps out on livelihoods and sustainable diets. And more recently, they've also used the opening of Rahuis to sell the fish and invest in really ambitious community purposes. So in the case of Rapa, which is couple weeks away of navigation from Tahiti, to invest in buying land for students that have to go to Tahiti for high school or university. And next slide. So one of the pitch here, and this is more food for thought, and we'd love to discuss this, and this is very simplistic, but the idea is that in the thinking of MPAs and permanent closures often, the idea is that the main benefit is spillover, and the beneficiaries are individual fishers, right? So we're more in an individual-based vision. Our argument is that, next slide, Tasha, please, is that eventually in temporary closures, the idea is maybe less about spillover, even though it can be in some cases, but of controlling the abundance in space and time of a resource that can be reaped by a community for collective benefits. And what's important with commoning, next slide, is that with commoning, it provides increased incentives for social control, self-enforcement, and stewardship around the management of these reserves. And this is a really important point we want to stress. Next slide. Obviously, there are some prerequisites for this to function as a commoning tool. One of them is pre-existing systems of collective action in communities. And the second one relates to property rights. And Ere is going to touch upon this right now.
Thank you so much, Jean. So in order to have these commoning processes happening, what we noticed is who has access to the resources is key. So who pays the costs for the closure and who receives the benefits? And in a large portion, that is going to be dependent on who has the access rights to the area. So in an area that is open access, the costs are paid by the community that enforces or protects that area, and the benefits are for everybody. And in an area with strong access rights, we see the opposite, or a different situation where the costs are paid by the community, but then the benefits are also received by that community. So in this other end of the spectrum, we find systems like territorial use rights in fisheries, which allow access to only a small portion of the community or a portion of the community. So also we started noticing that who has access allows for different levels of formality of the tool. And so these two things together are very important in order to categorize what's the context over which these temporary closures arise. So in areas where there's a lot of exclusive access, what we've found is that fishers can create more informal rules that are more flexible, and they can create closures that are open or closed, even not only according to ecological needs, but also according to economic needs. And on the other side, we find that areas where there's many areas where there's a need for a legal structure and a very formal institution to be able to create these temporary closures. So these quadrants have allowed us to map where many case studies are. And I'm gonna give you two main examples of where these two areas, these quadrants can allow us to place different temporary closures and how that affects design. So in the upper quadrant that I'm showing there, the one in blue, we have the case of El Rosario. This is the case that Jean just presented. Here, the communities can have more flexibility on creating their tool or not. So their tools are actually not formally recognized by the federal government, but they can recognize them as an agreement among the community members. This allows them to have a lot more flexibility on when to open and when to close these closures. And what we've noticed is that this allows for the community to have direct access over the resources, control how that access happens, and then once the benefits are received, to divide them equally among community members. So it's a really good tool for them to respond to economic stress. And then on the other corner, the opposite corner in yellow, in pink, I'm showing the case of 2 case studies that are placed in open access areas. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the second one, El Corredor. So in this case, the communities have closed areas for periods of 5 years, but the area around it is accessible to anybody along the Gulf of California in Mexico. So this is a case study in Mexico as well. And then in these areas, what fishers are going after is the spillover, because opening those areas for fishing can be very risky. So what the context is for all these cases determines what the optimal design is and how flexible the tool can be.
Thank you, Ere. Thank you so much. So I'm going to wrap up. So thank you all so much for bearing with us as we've discussed, kind of jumped around places and methods. I'm going to wrap us up by talking about success and failure. So we're here in this top part of our conceptual map, looking at the constructions of different types of stakeholders about these temporary closures. So I'm going to start at the highest level. So this is our systematic literature review. We had hoped to look at how fishers across different cases define the success or failure of closures, but this was not reported in most of the papers that we reviewed. And so what we ended up doing was evaluating how the author of the paper described the case. Did the author describe it as a success or as a failure? And this is what we found. Success is in purple and failure is in green. So what we found is overall, most authors describe these temporary closures as successes. And on the left, you have A through E. Those are different types of temporary closures that came out of our literature review. I'm not going to talk about it right now, but I'm happy to answer questions about it if this comes up in the questions. But what was even more interesting was the reasons why these authors framed these closures as successes or as failures. So the number one reason why authors described them as successes was for social reasons. That's in the bottom in yellow. But the number one reason why authors described them as failures was for ecological reasons. That's in the bottom in purple. So we might derive a hypothesis from this, which is that maybe temporary closures tend to be social successes and ecological failures. So let's dive into a case that we actually know quite well on our team. So these are the zonas de refugio that Ere mentioned. And these are a new type of temporary closure, newish type of temporary closure that's been emerging in Mexico. So my personal story of how I came to temporary closures, it was basically a happy accident. I was just starting my PhD and I ended up on a liveaboard boat for 2 weeks with 8 fishers from a really rural part of Mexico called the Corridor. And these fishers had never finished high school, and they were conducting these sophisticated ecological counts side by side with fisheries scientists from the government and from academic researchers. And the reason why they were doing this data collection was because these fishers had designed and proposed these no-take zones, these little tiny reserves that were temporary. And a bunch of people, the government, NGO, fishers, had invested a bunch of time and energy and money into making these little no-take reserves that were going to expire after 5 years. And because they were expiring, they needed data to know what to do after the 5 years. And it turned out that these zonas de refugio that I was studying were the first zonas de refugio in Mexico. Since then, just to give you a sense of how important this is, since then there's been over 40 that have been implemented around Mexico. And at the United Nations Oceans Conference this year, Mexico announced that it plans to expand to 83 zonas de refugio across the country. I'm not going to talk too much about the zonas de refugio of the corridor, but what I think is important to know for this group is that they were initially established for 5 years in 2012. In 2017, they expired. And what happened? They were dramatically expanded for another 5 years. And then in 2022, they expired again. There was some expansion, much less, but some expansion in 2022, and then some areas were moved. But overall, the areas that have been expanded or continued have not been open to fishing. So just to give you a sense of zonas de refugio as a general tool, There's some variation. I'm going to talk about them generally. Usually, zonas de refugio are 5-year areas that are banned from fishing. They're usually proposed by fishers themselves, but implemented by the fisheries agency of the government. Once they're implemented, they are legally binding tools. In this great conceptual framework that Ere presented, they are clearly time-bound. They expire after 5 years. Time-bound, yes. And then, but as far as cyclical openings, they are non-cyclical because they're not open for periodic harvest like the ones that Jean mentioned. And I want to mention that Jean talked about the case of El Rosario from Mexico. Slight complication, that is not a legal zona de refugio. And that is why it was able to be cyclical. That was a case of a cyclical closure. But zonas de refugio are non-cyclical, and so they fit very nicely here in this in our conceptual framework. And what we found from the case of the corridor in this paper that I published with a bunch of colleagues on a in-depth social and ecological data over years was that there seemed to be these positive feedback loops at play in their zonas de refugio. In many places, there were these win-win outcomes where these zonas de refugio were building trust and governance capacity, as well as building up biomass within these closures, and there's some evidence of it spilling over to support nearby fisheries. So, coming back to this question of success and failure, if we define success using some common social and ecological metrics, these were social and ecological successes. But there's some evidence that this might not be generically true for zonas de refugio across the country. This paper that Ere wrote with some colleagues looked at 18 different zonas de refugio targeting lobster. And what they found was that lobster catches and biomass inside these closures was pretty much stable after the creation of these zonas de refugio. So this, if the aim is to rebuild biomass, they're not necessarily doing that. You could call this an ecological failure or maybe ecologically neutral, and maybe they just need more time. But we might characterize these as ecological failures or neutral and social successes because the same fishers who had created them continued to reinstitute them. They were very popular amongst these fishers. So we had this kind of two possible stories of how zonas de refugio are working in Mexico, and we wanted to go collect our own data and ask fishers whether their closures were successes or failures and why. So we conducted surveys of fishers and managers in 4 places with temporary closures, and we came back to this conceptual model about property rights and the formality of the closure that Ere presented. We used this to structure where we'd go. So we sampled a place from each of the 4 corners of the quadrants, and we conducted these hour-long surveys with a focus on success and failure. And basically the first substantive question that we asked these respondents was the temporary closure a success or a failure? And we let them interpret what that meant. We didn't define what success or failure meant. Here's what we found. Okay, so blue, success, orange, failure. Overall, our respondents called these closures successes. And there's 2 interesting things here that I want to point out. On the left, where closures are informal, that is, these closures are not legally imposed by the government. And actually, just to be clear, these are not legal zonas de refugio. That's a legal tool. That's the right. On the left, these are community reserves. We're happy to talk more about this kind of complicated sampling in Mexico. But on the left, we have these informal reserves. They're perceived as successes. And on the top, this is the second interesting thing, where closures are implemented within exclusive right areas, they're also overwhelmingly perceived as successes. But in this bottom right corner that you can see there, this troublesome corner, this is open access conditions and a legal tool. The closure was seen as a success half the time and a failure half the time. And not only that, but when we look qualitatively at the answers are extreme in both directions. The supporters are in raptures about these zonas de refugio, while the detractors are saying that they're very unjust. And just qualitatively to give you a really sort of higher level image, reasons across the board why these zonas de refugio were called successes pointed to respecting the area and lots of fish. And the reasons why they were called failures was not about fish. It was mostly about the governance, the administration, that it was unfair that they had been excluded from participation. So I'm going to jump over to French Polynesia really quickly. We also had a great master student there, Paige Sliney, doing interviews. She did 100 interviews, and we found somewhat similar results to Mexico. So overall, fishers called this rahui a success, and they pointed out lots of fish, respect, similar themes as we found from Mexico. But I want to go back to this tricky corner here in the bottom right and dive a little bit more into this case of Celestun. So we asked them if it's a success or a failure. Majority of folks said failure. At the same time, those same people who called these zonas de refugio a failure perceived them generally to be ecological successes. So 96% of people who noticed ecological changes said there was an increase. And this really points out that these, when we come in with this idea that these must be for ecological reasons, they're obviously justified and the ecology is part of the system. But the reason why people point to these being failures is actually about the governance of the system. That is why they fail. And I want to end on a slightly more positive note than that. So at the very end of this long survey, we asked them this question: do you think things would be better if there had never been zonas de refugio here? And it's a negative question, so basically a no is positive. And the reason we did this was that we didn't want to have a positivity bias built into our survey. We actually wanted to have a negativity bias built into it, just to make sure that we were really getting people's opinions on this. And this is data from Celestun, the same place that had most people said it was a failure. In the same place, the majority of people said no. So they were glad there were zonas de refugio here. And this led us to think that maybe even when people perceive these as failures, these time-bound closures might be generating optimism about engaging in future rounds of closure design because they're determinate. They can engage in the future. So I'm going to leave on some conclusions, and I'm sorry we're over the time we had hoped to have a good discussion, but please, I'm just going to end on some high-level conclusions here. First, there's lots to learn. There are lots of studies on permanent MPAs and much less on temporary closures. The designs are very diverse. We didn't get into this, but our literature review has identified very diverse designs for these closures. As Jean talked about, adaptive capacity is built in to these temporary closures. And I really want to highlight this important point about commoning. This point that Jean made, that permanent MPAs tend, arguably to support this individualistic fishing activity, whereas these collective harvests can actually create opportunities for commoning. And Jean also talked about these visible benefits. Having opportunities to harvest in the closure creates benefits that fishers can see. But this is so important. We're not arguing that temporary closures are a panacea. They're not a panacea. And as we found, when buy-in is limited or fishers are excluded, the flexibility of these reserves can actually be their downfall over time. And finally, we started with this pretty provocative question, which is, should we fish MPAs sometimes? And I want to answer that. And my answer is a little bit of a bait and switch. We aren't advocating for fishing well-protected, well-enforced MPAs that are popular with local stakeholders. But maybe some of these areas that are fished sometimes, we could call MPAs. When we refer to marine protected areas, we actually might consider these areas with temporally dynamic protection regimes. They might still be conferring protection similar to, or even better than, classic MPAs. And as countries are trying to meet this 30 by 30 commitment, it might be useful to start counting, or at least start studying, these temporal closures. Thank you so much. Again, this is my email. Please feel free to write to me. I'm sorry the Q&A is going to be 1 minute, but please look up our website and write to us. Thank you all so much for listening.
Thank you so much. This was fabulous and really truly thought-provoking, provocative. We're glad you're doing this research, Tasha, Ere, and Jean. Do you guys have a couple minutes you could say later and we could do a couple questions at least?
I'd love to.
Okay. A question that came in early, but was just, are there temporary MPA or temporary protected areas for that sort of address invasions? Like then you could go fish out the invasive species, or if there's sort of perceived undesirable changes in trophic structure like urchin barrens?
I'll start that answer, and please, Jean, jump in. So one thing that we've noticed for these openings, that would be about openings, right? The openings of temporary closures are almost always very, okay, for nearshore fish, there's two types of fish. There's temporary closures in industrial fishing and temporary closures in small scale fishing. For temporary closures in small scale fishing, when there are openings, almost always empirically, they are very targeted. So they could, for sure, I've not ever seen it being used for an invasive species, for example, but the targeting of it makes them, I'd say, they're the kind of tool that would easily be adapted for that. Jean-Éric?
Yeah, so we've discussed a lot in our group, like how important the selectivity is at the moment of opening and how that opens a lot of doors. So it could be possible that the closure could be open just for control of some invasive species that could be also used for other purposes. And what is happening here is that we have evidence of different things happening, but these analysis and these studies are also allowing us to think of different options that probably are not being implemented right now.
Okay. All right. Thank you, guys. Another question. Thanks for your insights. Two things I was wondering. Do you think the current 30 by 30 framework is flexible enough to meaningfully incorporate temporary and cyclical protections, or do these fundamentally challenge the logic of the target? And is there a worry risk that some wider institutional shift towards impermanent could actually increase the risk of PAD events? Or is this risk more strongly tied to governance failures than protection duration?
Ooh, such an interesting question. Okay, so I'll tackle bits of that, and please, I'm gonna have to ask you to repeat parts of it. So, first of all, a major, OECMs are the first thing I think about in answer to that question. So OECMs are these, in 30 by 30, they say protected through either MPAs or these other effective area-based conservation measures. Long-term outcomes and permanence-ish is sort of built in also to OECMs as much as it is into MPAs. So I think that OECMs are not necessarily more temporally flexible than MPAs. I think that we often focus on the 30%, that 30 by 30, the number part of the target, but in that same target, the target's a paragraph long, right? The target has effective and equitably managed. And so perhaps temporary closures could actually help the qualitative dimensions of the target rather than the quantitative aspects of the target. And I totally played into this. I talk about 30% and trying to cover more area. But what if instead of imagining a bigger map, we instead imagined a map that's a darker color, right? Just really making higher quality protection. And so I think that that's one aspect in which these temporary closures could address it. I think that it would take some major shifts in the way that MPAs are conceptualized. But I mean, OECMs, I think, although they're not inherently more temporally flexible, OECMs is a space of people who are thinking about multiple uses, and I think that that would likely be where these would come in and fit. Joanne, do you want to tackle any other parts? I know I missed some aspects of that question.
Maybe just to add, one argument is the it's not only the point of 30 by 30 should not only be just having long-term management initiatives, but having long-term effects. And one idea is that potentially temporary closures, even though they are time-bound or cyclical, might have long-term effects as designs that are thought of as permanent. So, and one thing, so this is more empirical, but so for the risk of having impermanent closures being more open to risk of being downgraded or degazetted, or, well, the evidence shows that I'll let people from our team that are experts of Mexico, is that a lot of these temporary closures tend to be renewed. And that's a really interesting aspect, is that fishers, once they do have the power to decide what they do, and that time dimension is really important, well, often they take surprising decisions. Ask for a temporary closure first, and it ends up being something that's closer to a permanent closure because it's renewed every 5 years.
And I guess the last thing I'd say is one important way to understand, like, okay, like, is it likely to be a pad event, or is it likely to become, like, what is the design likely to be, is precisely this conceptual diagram that Ere presented. And as she mentioned, maybe in that bottom right corner, we would see areas that tend to be renewed. Maybe in that top left corner, we see areas that tend to be periodically harvested. So I mean, this has come out of a lot of discussions, a very simple, you know, two-dimensional thing, but I think it's a really important way to look at a lens on these temporary closures and understand what we might expect for different places. And imagine you might be a mayor living in a town that it falls somewhere in there, right?
Thank you, guys. All right, and we're going to go to one more question. I was actually wondering this question myself, so let's do it. Excellent presentation on a highly controversial topic. Given that the case studies focus on small-scale fisheries, how applicable are these findings to industrialized countries with high-cost, technically advanced fisheries, such as snapper and grouper? In what ways might differences in political processes, such as regulatory pathways, stakeholder influence, or industry lobbying, affect the relevance or adaptation of these lessons?
So I'm going to go ahead and start with an answer here. So yes, we are focusing a lot on small-scale fisheries, but we also need to, first, I think we need to recognize that small-scale fisheries are not only present in the global south, right? Like they're present in many, many countries that have industrialized fisheries. And what we found, at least in a few overviews, is that these tools are very much serving as a way for fishers, small-scale fishers, to provide some buffer from the impacts of industrialized fisheries. So I'm gonna say there's a paper that I just published with Anne Boudreau here at the University of Washington, where we looked at temporary closures in Alaska, which is an area where there's a bunch of very big fisheries, and how these are serving to protect the rights of different users of these resources. But I'll let others jump in to say more.
Oof, yeah, you've hit on something that on our team, so Yutian Fang actually has worked in industrial fishing, and our literature review is the only part of Tempo that really engages with empirically looking at existing closures in industrial fishing. They look so different in industrial fishing. The way that they look in industrial fishing is these roving bycatch closures that blink on and off. They tend to be very big and very short term, like 300,000 kilometers squared, and it lasts, you know, 2 weeks or something like that, or a few days. So they're very different than the closures that we have really dived into in depth. And I'll just say that I honestly would not feel comfortable extrapolating from that very light level of knowledge. So if anyone's interested in studying industrial fishing temporary closures, reach out to us. We'd love to collaborate with you.
Okay. Guys, fantastic. This was great to hear and get our mental juices flowing as we think about this. And thank you for diving into this understudied area. And thank you to all of our attendees who were full participants in the chat. And we really appreciate that. And we're glad you shared your expertise there. So I guess I'll just wrap up saying thank you so much, Tasha, Ere, and Jean. And we hope to follow up with you when you have more to report on further studies. We'd love to hear more about this.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the comments.
And thank you all. And we hope to see you in future webinars. Okay. Bye, guys.